The Honorable Errol McLeod has been Minister of Labour, Small and Micro Enterprise Development since the inauguration of the cabinet of Prime Minister Kamla Persad-Bissessar. That's following the general election in May 2010. He has acted as Prime Minister on several occasions between then and now. And 3 years on, and Minister McLeod is talking now about some of the initiatives he has taken and the decisions he has made as Minister of Labour. Well, Minister, good to have you. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
All right, let's start with, I think, the broad issue about the government's legislative reform program. But first of all, talk about the process of getting it on the table, and then we'll talk about the decisions you've made and the changes that have been wrought by that.
Okay. The Elections Manifesto of 2010, in which we would have identified what some are calling the labor agenda. I myself had identified in that document the labor agenda. Well, that document has been adopted as government policy. And thereafter, it was for me, as minister with responsibility for that area of government, to take to the cabinet notes that identified with our wanting to implement this, that, or the other. Okay. We would have prepared a schedule of our intention to change various pieces of legislation, to amend them, to bring into being new ones. But first, I think I want to identify what specifically we have said in the manifesto. And if you don't mind my referring to it, you know.
Certainly.
Some years ago, I would have rattled it off the top of my head. We talked about labor being put at the center of our development. Indeed, I have gone further to indicate, not just here in Trinidad and Tobago, but at the international level of the International Labour Organization, I went there and indicated that given our present circumstances, and whatever they may have been, and I'm talking about our global circumstances, there could be no development without labor. And similarly, there will be no labor without development. Yes?
Yes.
So if we were to internalize that, we would perhaps have a deeper appreciation for the approach that I have been taking on behalf of the government. So we talked about achieving a more equitable distribution of the wealth. And to do that, we had to ensure the objective of decent work. The ILO itself has defined what decent work is. And perhaps when we get a little bit later into our discussion, I would venture a definition of decent work. And in the manifesto document, we proposed amendments to be made to the Industrial Relations Act, the IRA. And I recall in an earlier incarnation, we would have worked together, you with the news, and I with the militant demonstrations and so on. There are many aspects of the Industrial Relations Act which were opposed by, I would venture to say, all of the trade unions, at least at their leadership level. Even as those trade unions' memberships at election time would have voted one way or the other for many of the same persons in their political parties who would have brought the yoke that is on that we consider to be around our necks insofar as labor legislation were concerned.
And there's the IRA, right?
The IRA.
And just for probably the uninitiated or the younger ones among us, the IRA was seen to have been an improvement on the ISA, the
Yes.
Industrial Civilization Act.
Yes. The ISA brought into being in 1965 against the background of progressive people being put under house arrest and so on. You must remember what happened with CLR James and all of that. And the kinds of struggles that were put up by the former George Weeks, President General of the OWTU at that time, and the betrayals that took place within the labor camp around that. So there were many issues in the IRA brought into being in 1972, which continued to put certain sections of the working population, certain categories of workers at more serious disadvantage than others would have experienced. And we spoke out, in tremendous ways against those. And we identified some of them. We said that there were two matters that we would need very clearly to address, and that we needed to treat with them with some urgency. And those two matters are, one, the right of workers to join a trade union of their choice, yes, so that we can enforce those rights and protect those rights. And we must go the way of dealing with the legislation that talks to workers' rights and so on. And the next one is that the current status of certain classes of workers, including domestic workers, gardeners, amongst others, they needed to be protected. You might recall that the IRA did not give any recognition at all to domestic employees and to gardeners and to chauffeurs. They, in other words, were considered to be just a close shy away from the conditions that affected slavery. Yes? So that the chauffeur, the private chauffeur, is seen as property. The domestic servant, as we would have called such people, seen as property. And we are saying, no, that must not be so. Indeed, in 2011, 2012, I led the country's delegation to the 101st, 2012, meeting of the International Labour Organization. And there we adopted a special convention that brings, in other words, the domestic employees internationally from the cold, and we are to put them into the same area of recognition as other workers. Okay, now for us to do that, the adoption of that ILO convention, for us to do that, we must ensure, and this is one of the areas that govern ILO standards and their conventions and so on. We must ensure that our local legal circumstances allow for the ratification of that ILO convention. We are committed to doing that, but we must make sure that our Industrial Relations Act, yes, opens the door for such to take place.
So there's an enabling environment, if you like, that has to be created before
Excellent.
The action has been taken.
Excellent.
Is that is, you would say, part of what is not understood and probably not well articulated as to why, for some people, it is taking so long to make that happen?
Well, I think that the people who have been identifying that the government and perhaps the Minister of Labour particularly have abandoned a commitment to do these things are people who know what I am saying, but are people who are with a different agenda. Yes? And I hope that today the point is made and is going to be seen. Now, to bring about amendments to the Industrial Relations Act, well, first of all, let me back up. Labor laws, especially in the context of the Decent Work Declaration by the ILO, labor laws are to be treated in a manner that will represent the inclusion of the social partners in the whole process of work and labor and all of that, employment and so on. So that this government's approach, indeed, it is my determination that the 144 committee, that is a committee set up by the ILO, and to which a number of countries, maybe all of the countries members of the ILO subscribe to, that 144 committee would look at conventions. They will examine the conventions. They will make recommendations to the minister. Yes, such recommendations would be taken to the cabinet to have particular laws, particular conventions ratified. Now, the 144 committee will study these recommendations before they come forward. The 144 committee is made up of the employers, the trade unions, and the government. That is the tripartite process. But we have gone beyond that, and in accordance with Section 80 of the Industrial Relations Act, we established the Industrial Relations Advisory Committee. That advisory committee is headed by a well-known practitioner in labor relations and an attorney at law, Lennox Marcel. And that committee is represented, that committee has on its board representatives from employer and business, labor and workers, government. It has academia. It has industrial relations professionals, yes? And that committee has been working assiduously. As a matter of fact, I think it is on Friday, 2 days from now, the minister will receive the recommendations of that committee. And those recommendations are going to be studied by a technical group that the minister will set up, identifying what we need to move expeditiously with, and then recommendations are made. We will have the consultation with the different groups and so on, and recommendations are made for particular legislation to be amended, and such amendments will come to the cabinet. The cabinet sends it to the LRC, that is the Legislative Review Committee, and then we proceed to the Parliament. Now, it is taking some time, and perhaps before coming into the office of minister, I might have thought that this is something that we could just run with. But committed to the process of tripartism, I could not just run like a bull in a china shop and do this thing. And I wish to assure the labor community particularly that their interests are being served and that they need only to have a bit of patience. I know that there are those who are particularly incensed by the process of decertification of trade unions. Now, I have even been criticized for having said that when I came to office, I discovered that there were injunctive measures applied against 3 trade unions. And I moved immediately to have those injunctive measures discharged, because there were measures that were taken by the Ministry of Labor as against measures that an employer might take against a union, right? And I don't know that the government should establish that an employer could not take measures against a union, right? Or that a union should not take measures against an employer.
All right, let's use the industrial relations terms here. In this case, discharge. It means dispensed with or proceeded with?
Dispensed with.
Okay.
Dispensed with,
Right.
yes. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
What we are going to do, certainly, is to bring about some balance to the process that either employer or trade union can take against each other. As it is now, for instance, an employer can move to have a trade union decertified. But I don't know that there is any provision that allows a trade union to have an employer decertified. And I'm sure that one would want to examine the consequences of that. You would want to examine that. If a trade union would move to decertify an employer, that trade union is also moving to throw its members out of work.
Yes.
So one has to, people have to consider all of these things. And perhaps at an earlier time, I may not have considered those things as I am now made to consider those things. Because, I'm advised, my father used to be a preacher, and my father would have said to me, as a trade unionist, one expects you to move as a trade unionist. Yes? As a father, one expects you to not move as a child. As a government minister, I feel certain that everybody expects me to move as a representative of the government. And I want to be the best representative that there could ever be.
Hence the question in my mind that I wanted to come to. And you tickled it a while ago when you talked about if you were in that previous incarnation, you may have thought that it was, or you would have, in many cases, thought that some of these processes should have taken not the amount of time that it is taking. And so the question is, what are some of the things, briefly, if you can touch on that, the things that you have learned now, you're learning now as a minister that you thought you knew, but you found out that it's not so easy?
Well, I'm learning now that one has to be more even-handed than I may have considered earlier. I'm learning now that you have to work with the partners. In the final analysis, whether Trinidad and Tobago goes forward, stands still, or regresses into some position of the past, those people, the workers, the employers, and certainly those who have been put as government, must be working in a way that will bring all of our efforts to use a big word, a confluence.
Yeah.
Yes? That is how I think it would be. And it brings me back to my opening point, that there will be no development without labor, and certainly no labor without development.
Yes.
That's
Development can't happen without labor.
Yes.
If let's say, or when the time comes, I was going to ask if for some reason an election is called now, but let's just say whenever it is called, how confident are you that you can speak on this question of the commitment that you've made and the things you've done and the government has done on the general issue of reform of the labor legislative agenda in Trinidad and Tobago?
Okay, I am going to answer that question. I'm burning to answer that question. But let me just, if you would allow
Certainly.
me. We identified changes to the Minimum Wages Act. As a matter of fact, minimum wages was one of those items which we promised to deliver on in our first 100 or 120 days.
120, I think.
Yes? And in fact, we delivered, the government delivered on minimum wages. Yes? We have since delivered on the Maternity Protection Act, bringing it to 14 weeks in accordance with ILO standards, yes? And we delivered on the Masters and Servants Ordinance, yes? Get that out of the way.
Change the name of it. And
Change, you know, well, not just change the name of it. Get it out completely. We are no longer in a situation where there is any master and where we are servants, yes? So we have delivered on those. Now to come to the question that you just asked me, I will answer it this way. I know that the situation these days is being identified as ticklish. I wish to assure the national community that if this government lasts its term to 2015, I will be in a position to say Trinidad and Tobago, as I have just indicated on minimum wages and maternity protection. Indeed, minimum wages is being reviewed again as we speak. I will be able to say on those other matters, yes, to which we have committed in the manifesto, we have delivered.
You have any fears that this administration would not go to full term? You said if.
Well, no, well, I hear, and I am normally more positive than I sounded just now, but I hear people who are identified as captains of politics and elections and so on. I hear people saying that there are attempts to bring down the government. Indeed, in the labor sector, one is on record, one of them, yes, in the labor movement, has gone on record as committing to pull this government down. And I wish that the national community will not forget that. You know, I wish to make the point that a trade union is not a political party, and a trade union leadership must be careful about what it says and does, because it has the interests of so many workers to look after. Yeah, and people are saying that the government is being threatened and this might happen and that might happen and so on. I know a whole lot of it might well be platform rhetoric, but I'm trying to indicate that what we have to do if we are going to reform labor legislation and so on in a way that will satisfy the commitments that we've made in the manifesto, it will take some time.
Yeah. And I mean, you don't have to necessarily respond to this, but I mean, from day one, there were the predictions that this government would not last 6 months, it wouldn't last a year, it wouldn't last 2 years, but it's past the halfway mark and it's going to pass 3 years.
I think it will make.
Right.
Indeed, I am looking to 2020.
Okay. Well, you're being much more positive than that you started. All right. Let's take it. There's another issue that I think there has to be some recognition of this, that the government inherited 75, this administration inherited 75 agreements in various stages of incompletion.